This is a production of Cornell University.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for that great introduction. So today I will be presenting on my thesis research, developing perennial grain cropping systems and market opportunities in the Northeast. I'd like to start with a few acknowledgments. I would first and foremost like to acknowledge the land on which this research was conducted and Cornell University operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Cayuga Nation, members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Today, this meeting place is still home to the Cayuga and other indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. I'd also like to acknowledge some of the people that have been quite important in conducting this research. I wouldn't have been able to do this all on my own, so recognizing Chris Pelzer, Sandra Wayman, Scott Morris, the techs for the Sustainable Cropping Systems and Weed Ecology and Management Labs and all their contributions. Cindy Bartell, who's a postdoc in the Sustainable Cropping Systems Lab and has been collaborating with me on many of these projects. And some of our undergraduate assistants and interns, only a couple of them from this year, but there have been many, many that have contributed to this work, and I'll also acknowledge them by name at the end. So just to let you know what we're going to be talking about today, we'll start with discussing perennial grains and why we're interested in them, why we're studying them, why they're important for sustainable cropping systems development. We'll then talk about thinking in a systems approach. How can you consider not just the growth of grain or forage, not just the interactions with weeds and diseases in the ecosystem, not just economics, not just sustainability, but all of those things together, how they interact to create a system that can have either beneficial or detrimental properties. I'll then discuss my research objectives for my thesis, talk about a few of the preliminary results we've seen over the last few seasons, and then discuss briefly some future work or continuation of work on these projects. So why grow perennials? Well, to take a step back, I think everybody here is probably familiar with the imposing food security issues of a growing population, changing climate, changes in diets, and degradation of much of our natural capital around the world. That's all sort of coming to a head at the same time and causing a lot of concern about how we're going to intensify crop production to feed 9 or 10 billion people without further degrading our natural capital and preventing that from being sustainable into the future. So here we have a diagram from Jonathan Foley and others that was published in Science that looks at the difference between a natural ecosystem, intensive monocultured cropland, and then cropland with restored ecosystem services. These bubble charts show sort of the magnitude of some of the services that are available from each of these systems. And you can see in a natural ecosystem, there are a lot of ecosystem services that are available, mediating disease, air and water quality, carbon sequestration, habitat for wildlife, biodiversity, but it really doesn't give you that much in terms of crop production, the food that we need to survive. In contrast, an intensive monoculture, particularly of annuals, gives you a large amount of crop production, but not so much in the other areas. And in fact, some have now started to think that instead of it just being a low amount of services available here, there's actually disservices in many of these areas that are created by intensive monocultures, such as soil loss, water quality impairment. The idea with restoring ecosystem services to agriculture, which doesn't necessarily need to be perennial, but perennial plants have been proposed to be part of this solution, is that you can still get crop production, maybe not necessarily the exact magnitude of monoculture, but restore many of these other services and therefore create a system that is more functioning and more sustainable over time. So then just to think about what it means to be perennial, I have the definition from Webster's Dictionary here. A plant persisting for several years, usually with new herbaceous growth from a perennating part. So we see perennials throughout natural ecosystems, not as often in agriculture, but in the context of agriculture, a perennial crop is one that you plant and then harvest in 1 year, producing some amount of product. And then in the following year, it'll regrow without having to replant, retill, do all of those field operations and other managements that are needed to have an annual cropping system persist. And so the benefits of perennial, as I said, there's fewer field operations, less tillage, no seeding after that first year. There's soil protection and enhancement. You have crops in the ground year round. There's erosion control. There's also a contribution of carbon back into the soil by the deep rooting systems. Reduced tillage doesn't disturb the soil structure or biotic community as much. Water quality enhancement by preventing the leaching of nutrients that often occurs in annual cropping systems. Taking advantage of the early and late season growth that these crops can come up as early as it warms in the spring and be there late into the fall, photosynthesizing and putting down energy to be used in the next year. And there's potential to grow them on areas where you might not be able to grow an annual crop, like on a sloped land where tillage would lead to extensive erosion, or in riparian areas where those nutrient movements off-site are more of an issue for water quality. There are major drawbacks, though, in particular lower yields. So at this point, some of the perennial grain crops we are working with are at about 25 to 60% of what a comparable annual produces in grain for a single year. And part of that is that there's some catching up we need to do in terms of breeding these perennials. We've been breeding annuals for thousands of years and very intensively for the last century or so. And we've only been working on perennials for about 40 years. There's also some inherent life history trade-offs that have been theorized between a perennial plant that is allocating more energy to persistence than to reproduction. That's one of the main benefits of an annual. But there is some thought that artificial selection can overcome that in the future. There are also restrictions to your options for management in these systems. You can't rotate crops, for example. So that does limit the ways that you can counteract disease buildup in the system. You also can't cultivate for weed suppression. So some problematic weeds might be only able to be dealt with through herbicides. And if those herbicides are not compatible with the crop, then you could be limited in your response to those weeds. But there is quite a lot of interest in perennial grains at this time. In particular, Patagonia Provisions in 2016 released Long Root Ale, which is a beer that was brewed using Kernza, one of the perennial grains that we're working with here, and emphasizing in the marketing of that product the regenerative nature of the crop production, building soil, protecting natural resources. And it was quite successful. This led to further interest from General Mills, one of the larger food industry firms, and their Cascadian Farms organic division, which wants to incorporate Kernza into some of their products. And General Mills is even interested in incorporating perennial grains into their entire product line, things like Cheerios, as part of their corporate commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So they have donated money towards research, and they're very involved in the research and development of these crops. So with that amount of industry support, there has been quite an increase in the amount of research and other activity in the perennial grains area. For our work here at Cornell, we're using two varieties of perennial grain. As I mentioned earlier, Kernza is Thinopyrum intermedium, or intermediate wheatgrass. This is a domesticated wild relative of annual wheat. So there are two main ways of developing a perennial grain crop. You can either domesticate a wild perennial plant, or you can hybridize a current annual crop plant with perennial relatives and try to introgress those perennial genes. So Kernza was domesticated actually starting around this area in the 1980s. Peggy Wagner at the Rodale Institute, in collaboration with folks at the Big Flats Plant Materials Center, selected intermediate wheatgrass as the most promising of several hundred wild perennial grasses that were screened, and then did several cycles of breeding and improvement there in work towards a perennial grain. In the early 2000s, that germplasm was transferred to the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, where a breeding project has been in place for the last 2 decades, working to develop what was eventually termed Kernza, which is the most productive of their varieties and has now been used in commercial food products. We also have ACE-1 rye, which is Cicale cereale, so your annual rye, but has been bred with Cicale strictum, mountain rye, and then back crossed to get some perennial genes into that rye. And this was originally started, the program was started in Germany, and then moved to Agri-Food Canada Lethbridge Research Center, where it was, the ACE-1 variety in particular was created. So now that we have these crops, there's a lot of interest from the food industry. There's a lot of interest in the sustainable agricultural community about them. We have to figure out how to grow them. We also have to figure out whether these ecosystem services that people have been touting are actually being realized and what's the magnitude of those benefits in practice. We have to figure out how they can fit into our current cropping systems. Is this something that's going to be widespread adoption, or is it really going to be in those small niche areas where you wouldn't be able to plant an annual crop because of erosion control, for example? And then how do they fit into the food system? If we produce these grains, and we need to figure out how we can eat them. For example, Kernza does not have the same glutens as wheat, so baking properties are much different. The same ACE rye is a little bit more similar to what you would do with an annual rye, because it is just a hybrid, but even figuring out whether perennial as a value-added proposition similar to organic produce is something that can make these things more economically viable needs to be determined. So I did mention we're going to talk about this from a systems perspective. So here we have a diagram of a typical cropping system. You have some natural resources that are inputting energy and material to the system. You have some purchased inputs, soil amendment, seed, fuel, labor, tools. And then you have all the interactions that are happening within the boundaries of the system itself. Interactions with soil, and then operations like tillage and planting that create a crop that is then harvested and produces products. There's also interactions with other species in the system, non-crop plants or weeds, pathogens, invertebrate pests, other animals that can contribute to yield reduction. There's also the economic component of assets of machinery and capital that are integral to this whole, the function of it. And so if we think about this in terms of where a perennial is going to change this, it's going to change the soil because of reduced tillage. It's going to change some of these inputs. There's less planting. There's less fuel and labor going into those operations. The crop itself needs to be understood and how it's producing grain and potentially forage, and the magnitude of that, and how to better optimize the system. We found recently that harvesting and processing of these crops is not a trivial matter. They can behave quite differently than what you would expect with annuals for reasons like smaller seed size, adhering hulls on the grain. They're not quite as free threshing as the annuals that have been developed for that purpose are. And then in particular, the interactions with these pests and pathogens in the system where you can't use some of your typical management tools that you would in an annual system needs to be studied. Oh, and finally, once we get to this stage with crop products, where are we going to sell them, for how much? That's a big question as well. So thinking about those things, we have developed 5 research objectives for one of our projects at Musgrave Research Farm. We want to quantify agronomic productivity of the 2 perennial grain varieties we have, understand the pest dynamics, assess impacts on soil health and erosion potential, estimate break-even price points for the perennial grains in comparison to annuals, and then evaluate the system-wide environmental sustainability of these systems using 2 different metrics. I'll just go through a few slides where we highlight the different parts of the system that we're looking at for each of these objectives. So in terms of agronomic productivity, it really is at the level of the crop plant and getting those crop products that are what we're hoping to produce with the system. But this does involve things, not in this study particularly, but there's so many things that go into agronomic productivity. What's the row spacing? What's the seeding rate? What's the fertilization rate? What's the harvesting method? What's the post-harvest processing? So all of that is something that needs to be considered before perennial grains can become a bigger part of our sustainable cropping systems. Our second objective, understanding pest dynamics. What species of weeds are going to be most problematic? What pathogens are going to be infecting the perennial grains? Is it the same or is it different than what we see on annual grains? And what's the magnitude and the impact of these pests on grain productivity and grain quality? We want to look at soil health as one of the main ecosystem services that could be realized from perennial grains. We want to quantify effects on physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of the soil. We also want to better understand the erosion factor. How much can these crops prevent erosion and even potentially add to soil carbon sequestration? The economic piece of it is to figure out what's the starting point for grain prices for these. Are they going to be commodity crops that are just used similarly to other grains in the market? Or are they going to be in a niche marketplace? Using enterprise budgeting techniques to quantify all of the inputs and then the productivity of a system, we can start to understand what the price point for a perennial grain would be, and then where it might fit into a food system. Finally, we're going to evaluate system-wide environmental sustainability by quantifying all of the inputs and outputs of the system and then comparing them with annual crops to see what the benefits might be here. So all of this is being done using data from a field experiment that was established at Musgrave Research Farm in the fall of 2016. We're comparing two perennial grains, the Kernza intermediate wheatgrass and ACE-1 perennial rye, to a warthog winter wheat and two varieties of winter malting barley in a randomized complete block design, and the split plot treatment of frost-seeded medium red clover. So just a sidebar about red clover. We're interested in intercropping and interseeding in the Sustainable Cropping Systems Lab, increasing the biodiversity of agricultural system and looking for complementarity between different species of plants. And so legume intercrops with grass is a very commonly used mixture. There's complementarity there with the legumes fixing nitrogen to allow the grasses to grow better. Legumes can also provide weed suppression. They can moderate the soil climate, increasing soil moisture and reducing evaporation, and they can contribute to a more diverse and soil microbiota. So we chose medium red clover as the legume we were going to intercrop in our systems due to previous work that had been done with alfalfa, white clover, sweet clover, that showed that the Kernza in particular, being a very competitive grass, would outcompete some of the other legumes. And medium red clover is a little bit more vigorous. We seeded it at a relatively high rate in order to try to overcome that competitive effect. And it seems to have worked. I'll show some slides about that. But it might be hard to see here, but in one of our split plots, you can see the side with clover in it being just a little bit more green than the side without. And the same thing happened with Kernza here, clover and then no clover. So in fall 2016, it was established, just some details about a false seedbed was used to reduce weed pressure, applied a target of 75 kilograms of nitrogen split between fall and spring, and then just some seeding rate details. Seeding rates were provided by the perennial grain breeding programs that we received seed from, and the annuals were based on information from our farmer advisory board of local organic grain farmers. So to look at what it looked like in fall 2016, Kernza did not look great. And it's something we've learned that it is a little bit slower to establish, and it takes off in the following spring. But it was a little bit worrisome at the time. Our wheat and barley looked fine. The rye was a little bit patchy, but that also did fill in. Moving forward to the first harvest, we did have a couple of issues. As I said, the Kernza did fill in, but maybe not the stand density we would have liked. Barley had some winter kill issues in that first year, which is actually why we switched our variety of barley into the second year to a more winter hardy variety. And there were some significant lodging problems with the ACE1 rye. This is a 6.5 foot tall crop, and we may have seeded at a high rate. There may be other factors influencing this, but in some plots, the lodging was as high as 60%. In our second harvest, you'll notice in particular that in the rye with clover, there was a persistence issue. We lost almost all the rye in that second overwintering, where there was no clover. There was some rye, but it was still not enough to combine. So this is one of the major things to be aware of in terms of certain perennial crops. Their persistence is important if they're going to be part of a productive system. We did figure out how to grow barley a little bit better in the second year. And then Kernza did regrow quite vigorously, although we did notice that its reproductive vigor was a little bit lower in the second year. That's something that's been found in other projects with these grains, that their yields do decline over time with the age of the stand. So now I'll go into some preliminary results. So for our first objective, looking at agronomic productivity, we collected biomass samples in 2017 and 2018 in half-meter squared quadrats. We separated crop biomass from weed biomass, and then separated the crop biomass into stems and seed heads. We did look at components of yield from a subsample of those seed heads. One thing to mention about Kernza is that it doesn't need to be dehulled. And we also harvested a strip from each of these plots using a Almaco plot combine. So to look at stand density in 2017 and 2018, barley was low due to winter kill. Kernza is consistent across the 2 years. Rye, we're seeing particularly with clover in the second year, was very low density. And otherwise, reasonable stem counts. We are seeing some effect, perhaps, of clover reducing stem density in certain cases, but we'll look at how that's affecting yield in a couple of slides. In terms of crop biomass, we did find that the perennials do produce quite a large amount of crop biomass, and since the phenology is different, they are green later into the season. That might be an avenue for a dual purpose forage and grain crop. We also did see that Kernza maintained this biomass production across both years, while rye, which was extremely productive in the first year, again, not persistent enough for crop system. And then grain yields, what many people are interested in, significantly lower yields for the perennials compared to the annuals. And in Kernza, we're seeing a decline of about 50% in that second year, and rye, we weren't able to harvest anything. We did notice, however, the benefit of clover in the grain, in particular for the annuals in the second year. So that seems to be a nitrogen effect. So to summarize these agronomic results, we really need to address the perenniality of ACE1, or it won't be an effective part of a perennial cropping system. Interseeding red clover seem to be a benefit to the system. Use of the perennials to produce forage might be part of making these more economically viable. And we will be doing grain and forage quality assessment. And then yield improvements through breeding and cropping system optimization are necessary in order for these to compete with annuals. in terms of productivity if we want to actually achieve those food security goals. In terms of understanding pest dynamics, we looked at weed community composition based on those same biomass samples taken in 2017 and 2018. Weeds were sorted by species, dried and weighed. And then in collaboration with Mike Fulcher in the Bergstrom lab, we scouted for disease and took disease samples in 2017 and 2018, cultured those in the lab, and also looked at effects on grain quality from fungal pathogens. In terms of weed biomass, we did see low weed biomass in the wheat and rye in the first year, and tended to be an increase in weed biomass from year 1 to year 2. In rye, the weed biomass increased dramatically. In Kernza, no significant difference in weeds from year 1 to year 2, but it was quite a bit there. We also did see a suppressive effect of clover, and actually one thing you're seeing with these is that if you added the clover biomass back in, the total non-grain biomass of the crops would be higher than it looks here. So the competitive effect of the clover in the rye is actually what we believe contributed to the extremely low stand density there. We also have done a community ordination, so I'll spend a little time explaining this. This is a way to visualize the difference between different communities of plants by extrapolating the statistical difference between abundance and of different plants in different samples. So how to interpret this is that we have our grain crops, barley being the square, Kernza the circle, ACE1 rye the triangle, and wheat as the diamond. And those are plotted for each plot. And then we also have the weed species codes showing the similarity or the likelihood that that weed species is relative to that plot in terms of distance. So the closer a weed species code is to a certain plot, the more likely it was to be there and the more abundant it was within that plot. We've also separated this between the first year, which is these lighter colored shapes for the plots, and the second year, which is the black shapes. And we are seeing a separation between those. So there were more species and more annual species in the first year compared to the second year. And then looking at these ellipses that indicate the confidence interval of each crop year interaction. We have the first year of wheat, the first year of barley, the first year of rye, and the first year of Kernza. And so they are overlapping quite a bit down here. In the second year, we did see that the annuals were starting to separate more from the perennials and what species were present in those plots and their abundance there. So just to highlight which is which so you can compare. The green is Kernza, the red is rye, the yellow and brown is wheat, and the blue is barley. For disease, working with Mike, we observed a number of pathogens in ACE1 and Kernza, in particular, many in Kernza. This is quite a laundry list for a single year's worth of pathogens. And we even found one pathogen, tar spot, which is most common in corn, not really been seen in small grains. So there could be even a higher diversity of pathogens to be worried about with some of these perennials. We did find that there were relatively high vomitoxin levels in some of the grains. So this is a concern and an issue that needs to be addressed. The USDA recommendation for vomitoxin is 1 part per million. So in both cases, we were above that on average. So to summarize, perennial grasses and certain rhizomatous dicots are likely to dominate our perennial systems, and we were seeing that in the second year of our weed assessment in particular. Clover can provide weed suppression. The weed control during the establishment year is what we believe to be critical. We have seen with some perennials that if they get off the ground and become competitive, close the canopy, that weeds really aren't a problem there. Perhaps even with rye, one thing we're considering is post-harvest weed control. We noticed that after harvesting the rye in the first year, that other species came right into that space. And without any control in the fall, it may not have been able to store enough resources to overwinter successfully. So we'll be looking at that in the future. We have looked at many pathogens, and we've seen some fungal contamination. Are there impacts on grain yield? Something to be looked into the future. The vomitoxin contamination is concerning, and developing integrated pest management strategies for use in perennial grain systems where certain crop rotation, cultivation are not available should be a priority in order to make these effective systems. In terms of soil health, we sampled in 3 years, just after planting and then just after harvest in 2017 and 2018, took aggregate soil cores from each plot and retained about 1 kilogram for analysis. Calculated bulk density, used LECO for nitrogen and carbon analysis, and did permanganate oxidizable carbon, soil respiration, and wet aggregate stability in the Cornell Soil Health Lab. We don't have any data on that to present at this time, but in the literature, Kernza has been shown to improve indicators of soil health, but not necessarily store more soil carbon than wheat over a period of 4 years. In 2019, we're going to conclude our soil sampling by doing a depth stratified sampling to maybe take a closer look at the soil carbon dynamics. We'll be doing some field measurements of erodibility with rainfall simulators and universal soil loss equation modeling to determine the difference between the perennials and annuals. I do have these 2 pictures, which were taken at Musgrave in April of 2017, showing after a 2-inch rainfall event in the span of about 3 hours, some gully erosion that occurred in an adjacent wheat field, and little to no evidence of significant erosion in the Kernza field right next to it. And for sense of scale, the surveying pin's about 1 foot long, so there was 6 to 8 inches of soil loss in this field in that one rain event. And with the intensity of these types of extreme weather events, the frequency and intensity of them increasing, this is a major concern and a major benefit of perennial crops. For the economic analysis, we're planning on doing full enterprise budgets, but for the purpose of this presentation, was only able to get to partial budgets. So the benefits, the variables that we're considering include field operations, land rental prices, seed, fertilizer, and then the production of grain and biomass for forage or straw. We will be conducting sensitivity analysis to look closer at the yield over time using net present value to estimate the break-even point of these perennial crops in terms of how long they're in the ground. We will look at whether price premiums for perennial products, how that influences the economics of it, and what if the increases to yield of perennials that's coming down the pipeline in terms of breeding or even optimization of our cropping systems can play a role there as well. So just for our preliminary results with the partial budgets, what we did was we compared Kernza and ACE-1 to wheat in terms of the costs and then the receipts from each system. And then we looked for a total revenue and then used a goal-seeking algorithm to basically change the prices that we were putting in for Kernza and ACE-1 until they matched the revenue available from wheat to get that break-even price. And so you can see some of the costs are different, in particular the tillage and planting and seed costs in the years after that first establishment year for the perennials. And that could be a piece of changing the profit margins on these perennial grains compared to annuals. So what did we find? Very high prices for the perennials at this point due to those low yields. $3 a kilogram is very high. I will say for Kernza though, When Patagonia was sourcing the Kernza for their initial long root ale product, they were paying over $1 a pound for Kernza for that. So this isn't too far off of what somebody actually paid for these products in terms of getting it into their processing. In terms of running a few sensitivity analyses, this was done to see what yield Kernza and rye would need to produce if they were valued at the same price as organic winter wheat. And we're seeing that the yields are a little bit lower than what you would expect from a typical organic wheat field, which is about 4,000 kilograms. And the prices do decrease if you assume that the perennial yields stay steady over time. Future work will include expanding these to full enterprise budgets to look more at the margins, and then more modeling and research into the food value chain of where these crops will be produced, processed, and then sent to market. Our last objective, looking at system-wide environmental sustainability, we'll be using two different analyses. The first is emergy, or embodied energy, which looks at all of the inputs to a system, including natural resources such as solar radiation, rainfall, wind energy for pollination, and the soil that's supporting the system, and then transforms all those values into a common unit for comparison across systems, and calculates certain sustainability indices based on the ratio of renewable resources to non-renewable resources that are used therein. We'll also be using the farm energy analysis tool, which is a static model that was developed to estimate greenhouse gas emissions and fuel usage within farming systems. And that's based on parameters such as type of tillage, the crop area and yield, residue management and removal, and some certain inputs such as fertilizer rate, seeding rate, pesticides, and fuel consumption. Just to wrap up, I will mention a couple of our other projects that are going on that aren't necessarily going to be into my thesis. We are looking at intercropping peas with these grains, and also looking at other agronomic factors such as nurse crops and row spacing in this project. We are looking at how to renovate an older Kernza stand to try to stimulate new reproductive growth. And one way that we've thought about that is to use strip tillage for root zone disturbance and encourage increased tillering thereafter. And this has shown some promising preliminary results using fall strip tillage and then allowing it to regrow through the fall and into the spring. And then finally, looking at more closely at the yield components of Kernza. This is a multi-site project here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Kansas to understand the development of the crop in different climates and different regions, and relate that back to more important agronomic considerations such as harvest timing and processing. So I'd like to acknowledge many people that have contributed to this work, in particular my committee members, Tony DiTomaso, Matt Ryan, and Miguel Gomez in Applied Economics and Management. All of the lab members of the Sustainable Cropping Systems and Weed Ecology and Management Labs, many undergraduate research assistants, our Farmer Advisory Board, and many external collaborators, in particular with the Kernza projects. Oh, I think that's the wrong photo. Thanks for listening.
We have time for questions.
With respect to the difficulty of establishing Kernza, is that because the seed viability is low, or is it because of some partial dormancy or bigger problem?
Well, since it's a very small seed relative to our annuals, it just takes a little bit longer to get going in the fall. It doesn't grow as rapidly. It doesn't have the energy resources to do so. And I think at Musgrave, part of our problem is not, like, we're learning how to grow these crops, and things like seed placement can be very important for a smaller seeded species, trying to target it at half-inch seeding depth and maybe getting a little bit, not having the precision to place it right with some of the equipment we're using. There's also some factor of soil moisture content and how that could affect. So it's a little bit more sensitive to some of these variables. So finding a way to, and it might involve seeding rate, it might involve not fertilizing in the fall, which some people have in Kernza research have shown to really just feed the weeds. The Kernza is not able to uptake it. It hasn't developed its root system extensively enough to fertilize, to uptake fertilizer in that first fall after planting. Working through a lot of those questions will probably contribute to enhanced establishment, and then weed control in that period as well, whether through cultivation by planting in rows and then cultivating in that first period before it's able to spread into the rows, or using chemical methods for weed control until it gets off the ground in the following spring are some options that we'll probably have to look at. Yeah, Chuck?
Yeah, you mentioned the high vomitoxin levels. And I know some farmers manage to lower their vomitoxin levels by running the wheat through a seed cleaner. And I wondered if those levels were before or after cleaning.
So those had not been cleaned. And that's something that we've been considering, is whether there are economic ways to remove the contamination. Another way is to simply blend with other seed. And I didn't mention it with Kernza, because of some of its baking properties, it is being used in flour blends for baking. So it might not be as much of a barrier, but it's definitely something that needs to be understood and managed better. Ideally, there wouldn't be that contamination, but yeah.
I was wondering, this is kind of a more general question about, are you linked to the breeding efforts you mentioned? What's the status of breeding, or trying to address some of the issues?
Yeah, so we are part of a group that has been working on Kernza pretty closely together, and that involves both breeders, agronomists, even food science folks at the Land Institute, University of Minnesota, University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Manitoba, here, Ohio State, Iowa, Sarre Leone in France. So there's an extensive research network around Kernza right now, and the main breeding efforts are happening at the Land Institute, Minnesota and Manitoba. And they are, we're using what they call cycle 4 Kernza in these projects. And the Land Institute's now on cycle 8. And they're seeing averaging 20% yield increases across those cycles. So there has been quite a lot of advancement in that. And it's even accelerating due to the use of genomic selection rather than more traditional phenotypic selection. You can imagine with a perennial where you might need to grow it for 5 years in order to actually phenotype it correctly, that's a barrier to rapid breeding. But with genomics, they're accelerating that process. So the short answer is that yes, we're in contact with them. We're getting new varieties and seed. We just planted 6 new varieties out at Caldwell Field this fall, and we'll be evaluating those varieties for the northeastern climate in collaboration with others. And hopefully that will be a big part in the progress of perennials, making them a viable cropping system. Yeah.
So you mentioned that Kernza was originally started at Rodale and then moved to the land, and those are, of course, real different climates and soils than what we have. So the new varieties, has there been selection pressure during the variety development at any of those sites, like in Minnesota or Manitoba, that might be more similar?
Well, that's what we're hoping to discover with these new lines that we received this fall. So we got 4 lines from Minnesota, and those we would expect there would be some difference based on the selection in different climates. So we'll be comparing those with some of the Land Institute varieties at the same time and seeing what comes out of that.
So they were actually selected, not just evaluated, but there was some selection that went on in Minnesota.
Yeah, they've got lines that they're going to have their own varieties pretty soon.
Can you, excuse me, so you're comparing the perennial crops with sounds like an organic annual crop system in each case. Can you just say a little bit more about that, sort of what you're comparing it to and how you chose that? So why organic, you know, what kind of rotation, et cetera?
Yeah. So we chose to compare it to organic small grains because currently there aren't chemical weed controls or pesticides that are labeled in Kernza or perennial rye. So we thought that'd be a good starting point. Also, Patagonia is 100% organic. General Mills Cascadian Farms is an organic line, but their broader product line is not. And they actually are very interested in conventional production just to increase the scale. That would be for them to get enough grain for their products. So that influenced our decision there. We're also the Sustainable Cropping Systems Lab, and a lot of our work is into organic agriculture. So having some level of prior knowledge in that was a contributing factor there. But definitely looking into conventional going forward is something that would be needed to have this be as widespread as it could be. In terms of rotation, we realize that there is some artificiality. We're growing wheat after wheat after wheat in the same plots in our comparison. So there's going to be an effect there. It's hard to. So there was no rotation within this experiment in particular, and we think that there might have been some disease buildup in the wheat and barley into the second year. So that is sort of a confounding effect. But it's without having massive experiments, it's hard to have enough variables to control for everything that you want to. So it was sort of a simplicity decision there. Tony, did you have a question?
You answered it. It was basically the role that you would see for Kernza in conventional systems. And what have you heard from growers? Are they open to wanting to integrate that into their systems?
There's a lot of people that are interested. I would say in terms of growers that are looking to adopt some of these crops, they might be a little bit too early at this point. There's still work that needs to be done. On the other hand, there is the demand from the food industry to have grain to work with in their research and development programs, or even for, I think Patagonia is putting out a new Kernza beer pretty soon. They even want to expand to the East Coast. So that is a sort of an interesting time to live in, is like, well, from a research perspective, I don't think that we've quite figured it out, and I don't want to recommend a farmer try this and then have it fail in their fields. But if there's an economic incentive because of a high demand for the product, then there's that consideration as well. Julie?
Yeah, is there any evidence that the Kernza or the ACE1 rye are serving as habitat for beneficial insects and or pathogen, non-pathogenic, but other types of organisms?
So I actually don't know of anyone that's looked at that. I can go back to one of my slides to point out just a pretty cool thing that we saw in one of the fields, is that there's birds nesting in our Kernza in relation to actually a wild parsnip plant. So we didn't want to get too close to it. But this is sort of showing that potential for enhanced wildlife habitat by having it in the ground year round. I will say Ducks Unlimited has been in talks with the Land Institute about perennial grains as a way to increase the habitat potential of cropland. So that is another possible benefit of these systems, but it hasn't been looked at very closely as far as I know.
I mean, when you talk about systems,
Mm-hmm.
I think about not only the impact of the particular crop you're growing, but its impact on others.
Yeah.
So I know it's outside the scope of your experiment, but within a landscape, for example, if you had so much proportion of these perennial grains, how much could they affect positively the other annuals that might be growing in the same area with respect to pests and diseases? So that's why my question.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm curious, do you know anything about, so the declining yield over years, does that seem to be cyclic, or is that we just assume that they zero out?
So the theory is that The life history of the plant is to reproduce more seed when it's younger, and then as it ages, trail off. That part of our reason for looking at strip tillage is it could also be interest-specific competition or signaling between plants saying, okay, this space is full now. We're not going to produce as much seed. We're going to focus on developing deeper root systems and competitive strategies like that. So I think that it could be a little bit of both. It could just be the life cycle of the plant. It could be that competitive effect that's affecting it. But if we can better understand that and even manage it, that would contribute to a more persistent, sustainable system as well. Yeah, Christine?
I know you've been thinking a lot about herbicide resistance, which is a big problem in annual crops. Do you expect there to be a shift if there was widespread adoption of perennial grains? Do you think that would affect herbicide resistance?
This is sort of my personal opinion, but I've been thinking about it a little bit of how to incorporate chemical weed control into perennial systems. And I actually think that there could be some real benefits there as well. Because of the idea that if they get past establishment and establish well, then they'll outcompete other weeds. So in the 5-year projected lifespan of a Kernza field, you could spray once or twice in that first fall and spring to clean up the weeds that are there. And then for the next 4 years, not have to spray anything, which you could, obviously you're reducing the amount of product that's being applied to the field and thus reducing selective pressure for herbicide tolerant weeds. We're going to be looking at the seed bank in the spring. It could have an effect on the seed bank if other seeds are from other weed species are fatally germinating underneath there. So, and it's not necessarily related to your question, but in terms of organic, which it has been, I think that there's potential for certain farmers to transition to organic using perennial crops, where you could use your sort of final dose of herbicide in that establishment, and then the next 4 years, no herbicide application, keep your records, and by the end of it, there's organic certification on the line as well. So I think there's potential in those areas too. But I do think that work on herbicide efficacy and the impact on the crops, finding viable herbicides would move along a lot of perennial grain systems, conventional systems. Hasn't really been done so far.
So we're at 1:15, so why don't we pull up for questions? Let's thank Eugene.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.